Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're delighted to be here tonight in partnership with the Gay Johnson McDougall Center for Global Diversity and Inclusion at Agnes College, and are especially grateful to Dr. Régine O. Jackson, who is the Assistant Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the initiative's faculty coordinator for Summit Global Learning. She is also the Lawrence Ashe Associate Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at Agnes College, and she is the person who reached out to us about this partnership and helped make this connection. So thank you so much to Dr. Jackson for making this evening possible. Tonight is part of a larger celebration of the life and work of Dr. King, and we are proud to present Dr. Régine M. Jean-Charles in conversation with Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes for Dr. Jean-Charles's book, Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience Today. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Jean-Charles, who is a Black feminist literary scholar and cultural critic who works at the intersection of race, gender, and justice. She is the author of Conflict Bodies, The Politics of Rape Representation in the Francophone Imaginary, as well as the forthcoming Looking for Other Worlds, Black Feminism, Literary Ethics, and Haitian Fiction. She's also a regular contributor to media outlets like the Boston Globe, Ms. Magazine, WGBH, America Magazine, and Cognoscinetti. You might have to tell me how to pronounce that one. I apologize. I should have asked. Where she has weighed in on topics including #MeToo, higher education, and issues affecting the Haitian diaspora. Again, Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience Today is the book we are gathered to celebrate tonight. And we are gathered with Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes, who is a clinical psychologist, public theologian, and ecumenical minister whose work focuses upon healing the legacies of racial and gender oppression. A professor of practical theology and pastoral care at Columbia Theological Seminary, right down the street. Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes is the author of I Bring the Voices of My People, A Womanist Vision for Racial Reconciliation, and the much-loved Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength, as well as nearly 24 journal articles and book chapters in theology and psychology. So welcome to you both. We are very delighted to have you here tonight and to have you as part of this special celebration, ongoing celebration of Dr. King's life and legacy. So we encourage all of you who are watching at home, feel free to ask questions if you like. You can ask them in the chat or via this Ask a Question tab at the bottom center of the screen. And we will try to work those into the conversation. But mostly we just want you to kick back and relax and enjoy being in the presence of two great scholars discussing this important book. So thank you for being here tonight, and welcome to everyone.
Thank you, Yar. And thank you, Charis, and for everybody, to Dr. Régine Jackson for putting this all in motion. And so I'm grateful to be here with Dr. Jean-Charles, and I just would love for you to start with a reading from this fantastic book.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chanequa. It is such an honor to be in conversation with you. I just think about, your work in terms of healing the legacies of trauma for gender and racialized trauma is something that is so needed in our world. And I'm just grateful to you for how you really labor in that vineyard. And thank you so much to Charis Books and, of course, to my dear friend and mentor, really, Dr. Régine Jackson. So yes, I will get into it and I'll start reading. I'm going to read from chapter 3, for which the title is Ending Sexual Violence. And, just for anyone who's not familiar with the book, The Trumpet of Conscience Today is a book that examines 3 contemporary social justice movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and prison abolition, through the lens of a set of speeches that King gave in 1967 called The Call to Conscience, or The Trumpet of Conscience. And part of what I do in the book is I kind of argue that we need to pay attention to other speeches that King gave, especially the ones that he gave towards the end of his life, and that we need to remember that actually our contemporary activists are really also executing and offering a corrective to his vision in many ways. If we do not stop to help the rape survivors, what will happen to them? On the second day of Christine Blasey Ford's testimony before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in 2018, I could not stop crying. I wept intermittently throughout the day for reasons related to Blasey Ford and beyond. Ford testified to address her allegations that Brett Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted her almost 40 years prior. As a Black feminist scholar and activist, the hearings were painfully reminiscent. For me, the hearings were painfully reminiscent of the Supreme Court nomination hearings of the 1990s, when Anita Hill testified with her allegations of sexual harassment at the hands of Clarence Thomas. On the second day of Blasey Ford's testimony, I was traveling from Boston to Chicago for the 20th anniversary celebration of the performance Story of a Rape Survivor. After boarding the plane, I accidentally put my coffee on the wrong seat while placing my luggage in the overhead compartment. The coffee spilled. When I returned to what I thought was my seat, a white man was waiting for me and furiously began shouting at me for what I had done to his seat. I tried to explain that I thought the seat was mine and that this was an accident, but he continued to shout. He called me stupid. I asked him not to raise his voice. Eventually, the flight attendant intervened. I went to my seat, and the women around me looked on sympathetically. I could not stop crying. When I landed in Chicago, I saw reports of Blasey Ford on the screen and began to cry again. Quote, I am not here today because I want to be. I am terrified. End quote. Dr. Blasey Ford said. The terror was audible in her voice, which seemed to tremble with her every word. I was crying for her and for all of the survivors that I know. I was crying for those who shared their stories in public and for those who never would. I know from the work that I have done with survivors and my research on rape culture that coming forward to share stories of sexual violence is already challenging without the pressure of a national and largely unsympathetic audience, let alone being televised. I was crying over my sadness at the small and large injustices that occur every day and that train women to believe that we do not matter as much as men. I was crying because I remember being in 8th grade when Anita Hill testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee and when Clarence Thomas was appointed to the Supreme Court. I was crying because I know too many women who do not feel that their voices, their stories, their trauma, their lives matter. If we really believe in the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that, quote, injustice anywhere is indeed a threat to justice everywhere, end quote, then the forms of injustice that are gender specific should be of concern to anyone who cares about justice. Taking King's words seriously means including sexism, misogyny, transphobia, and homophobia in our march for freedom. Although King is hardly known for waging a struggle against sexism and misogyny, any accurate application of his message today requires that we pay attention to how sexism, misogyny, patriarchy, and gender inequality are also concerns of a faith that does justice. Many of his positions in the Trumpet of Conscience can be applied to the movement for gender equality in general, and most recently, the Me Too movement in particular. A better model who explicitly championed the rights of women as she participated in the Black Freedom Movement was Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights activist and voting rights activist who is not nearly as well known as King. When Hamer famously declared that nobody's free until everybody's free, it was not only in reference to race. Everybody means every human being, regardless of gender, sexuality, age, or ability. Our freedom relies and depends on the liberation of others. Individual freedom matters little without attention to the collective. Lesbian poet Audre Lorde unpacks this point even more, explaining, I am not free as long as any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And I am not free as long as one person of color remains chained, nor is any of you. Our freedoms are linked. Thank you.
Thank you. I am so glad you read that passage. Even though it is difficult to hear, especially at the beginning, it triggers so much, right? The Blasey Ford testimony and the way in which it was ignored, echoing back to Anita Hill, and and I was in college at the time, and so that, and then your own experience on that plane, right? The sense that like we can't get a break, and the fact that you open up with that like you moved us to chapter 3, like, so as you started and said, I'm going to move to chapter 3, and I thought, oh, she's just really gonna take us right there, right? Like, because when I got to that chapter and I saw the title, I was like, huh? In a book about king, huh?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And then gender equality is not something necessarily that we just, like, when we think about it, we're like, oh yeah, let's look to the words of Martin Luther King for, for that. And the way in which you tie those 3 occurrences together with his legacy, but then also point us when you're like, and a better model.
Throwing a little shade.
A better model would be Fannie Lou Hamer. And then you go on to name these other, not just her, but these other, like, to show Black women got it, even though he didn't get it. Black women, Rosa Parks, Ida B. What, like, you name how they got it. I love that chapter. I love the book, but I love that chapter and the way in which you made me see. It's the way you started out by saying that activists today are building upon and improving the legacy, right? It's not a break from the legacy, so that Me Too is an extension of the legacy, even though we wouldn't necessarily associate, sexual violence or the ending of sexual violence with King's vision. Yeah. I love I think this is the question, that what brings a Black feminist scholar activist, one who is concerned about sexualized violence against women, particularly Black women especially, to say there is something about King's vision and legacy that speaks to the issue of sexual violence against women, that speaks to the issue of Black women today. How did you get there?
This is why I love, like, Black women and Black feminists, because I'm like, these are the perfect people to be in conversation with about this book. So, so 2 things. I can't answer that question without talking about the story behind the book, right? Which is why I came to write the book. So in 2019, I was invited to be a keynote at an MLK breakfast, right? I'm always like, why is it always breakfast? I don't understand. Like, where are the MLK lunches and dinners? Like, why is it always breakfast? But anyway, I was invited to be a keynote at an MLK breakfast. And at first I really didn't want to. I mean, I was like, oh, this, like, but then I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I want to approach it through a different angle from what people usually say. I refuse to talk about I Have a Dream. I refuse to talk about a colorblind vision. I refuse to talk about nonviolence. And actually asked my friend, who's another Black feminist literary scholar, Soika Colbert, my dear, dear friend, who's a professor at Georgetown. And I was like, what do you think is the least known of King's speeches? And she was like, definitely the Trumpet of Conscience. And I was like, perfect. So I was like, I'm going to talk about the Trumpet of Conscience. And so I gave this talk called Taking King Out of the Box. And I argued that one of the ways that we can take King out of the box by reading his later work, like the Trumpet of Conscience, by thinking about the people that surrounded him, right, as opposed to him, right? So thinking about the Ella Bakers and the Fannie Lou Hamers, focusing on the women, essentially. And by looking at the more radical parts of his vision that make us uncomfortable. And I turned it into an op-ed because, as I always tell my students, don't waste your writing. Like if you write a talk, turn it into an article, turn it into an essay, turn it into an op-ed. So I turned it into an op-ed, and then a publisher approached me and said, "Oh, would you like to write a book about this?" And I said, "No, I wouldn't." I was like, I'm a Black feminist scholar. Like, I'm not a King scholar. I have another book, I had another book that I was in the process of writing, which was going to be my second book. And for the university that I was like the book I had to write to, get to full professor, was an academic book. And they were offering me to write this trade book. And I was like, well, when I write a trade book, it won't be about this. So no, thank you. But I literally like really prayed and discerned, right? And had my spouse, who was like, babe, I think you have to do it. Like, he was just like all about it. And he was like, this is your opportunity to reach people beyond the academy, beyond Haitian studies, beyond Black feminist studies. And they're people that would never pick up any of your work that would pick up a book about Martin Luther King. And so put your spin on it. And so, another one of my writing partners said, well, if you do it, make sure you do it on your terms. And that's when I said to them, I will do it, but this is how I want to do it. And I want to write about the Trumpet of Conscience by looking at it as a lens to apply to these contemporary movements. I want to use my expertise and my lived experience as a Black feminist scholar, as a person of faith, as a parent, and take all of the things that are important to me and bring that to King, right? And so this book, so that's part one, but then this chapter, I had a conversation with another Margaret Burnham, who's actually like the great civil rights activist recently, and we talked about this chapter, and I said, the thing this chapter was in some ways the most difficult to write and the easiest to write. The easiest because I've already written a book about rape culture, right? Like, this is kind of where I live, right? My teaching, my research, my activism is about ending gender-based violence. So it was very easy for me to kind of go there. And I knew that I wanted to include that in the book. But what I did was, whereas in the other chapters, I take the Trumpet of Conscience and look at it as a lens to analyze the movements. In this chapter, what I'm doing is looking at the movement to end gender-based violence, and then looking at King's legacy and looking at the Trumpet of Conscience and saying, oh, what a missed opportunity. How much more, right, could this have been if he had the kind of gender politics that would incorporate sexism and misogyny and patriarchy in his analysis, right? Like, how much more would we have gained? How much more profound would this legacy be if he could have had this more capacious, gender inclusive vision? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciated that you didn't romanticize his gender politic, right? I mean, at one point you talk about, yeah, he was a man of his time when it came to gender, which is, ironic, because it's easy to just dismiss it as that, right? Just to say that, but you don't let him get off with that, right? Because he was also progressive. He was not a man of his time in all these other ways, right? With militarism, with materialism, with racism, he was ahead of his time. But with gender, he was firmly entrenched in the gender politics. So I love that you don't write the book in a way that says, and we're just gonna glide over this, right? But rather like, no, this is where he missed the mark.
Correct.
And it's almost inexcusable that he missed the mark because he had people surrounding him, right?
Mm-hmm.
He had the relationships with the Ella Bakers and the Rosa Parks, and he had those relationships.
He had Bayard Rustin, like he had a queer, like he had an openly gay, close colleague, right? That he was not bold enough or courageous enough to allow to be at the forefront and foreground all the organizing that this person was doing. He had the opportunity to say queer lives matter, but he wouldn't.
Yeah. When I was reading that chapter, I kept thinking about Coretta Scott King's memoir, right? Because she also didn't really pull punches about her husband's sexism, right? And she talks about when she had to confront him about the fact that she had a call too, and that he didn't respect that he really saw her as her role was to be home, even though at the same time, she was his absolute partner. He was always bouncing ideas off of her that really she fleshed out his commitment to nonviolence, right? But so I was thinking about that and wrestling with that and glad that you didn't let him off the hook but also helped us to see the ways in which, as short-sighted as he was, how still you can look back and you can see the evolution, right? I think you used the phrase, the evolution of his thinking, right? And it makes you imagine, yes, based on the track that he was on, he would have gotten here, right? I think he would have gotten
I
here.
hope so. Yeah, I missed my hope. Yeah.
It's hard to imagine that he would, but yeah, I think to see that. And one of the things that I ended up, even though I started like the chapter like, oh, but at the end, what it helped me to recognize, I mean, I'm a pastoral theologian, so I'm always like, for every finger you point, look back at yourself, right? It really helped me to realize, like, and think about what are the ways that we're missing the mark now that will be so obvious to us like 30, 40 years from now, right? Because he was and like, oh, but that's us too, right? That
That's right.
we are
Because
very
because no movement is perfect. Correct.
Yes.
You're 100%, 1,000% correct. There's no, and I also think for me, this is the benefit of having a faith perspective where I never feel, and also my perspective as someone that's worked with survivors of sexual violence, right? Where I'm very much about the gerundive, the working through of something, right? So the working out of our faith or the healing process as opposed to like a finite or completed thing. So I'll never say like, oh, I have arrived. Like I have the best gender politics and I'm so progressive and I know it all and I understand. But I'm like, oh, no, this is a process. And there are things that I'm missing all along, right? There are ways in which, even though I call myself a feminist and I say I'm anti-hierarchical, there are moments when I, especially as a child of Haitian immigrants, in my parenting, I am fully embracing hierarchy, right? Like I'm fully embracing. So it's also this understanding of like we evolve. And I think, and this is what Margaret and I were talking about too, because I told her that, my hope and my prayer is that King would have eventually gotten there. And it's so sad because we don't get to see it because he wasn't always there with the class stuff, right? And he started to talk about poverty more towards the end. And he started to understand that he couldn't just have a racial analysis. He needed to have an economic analysis, which to me means that he was saying, oh, he was getting towards like this intersectional lens, right? Maybe he would have gotten there, but he was killed, right? And so we never know. And I think the message for people like us, but also like, especially for our students that I really try to convey is like, your thinking can evolve.
Yeah.
Your thinking can evolve and that you might not have so Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, who's the great Haitian intellectual, I had a good friend who was his student, and she said that he would always say to her, no one's ideological checkbook is completely balanced at all times, right? So there are going to be some places where you fail, even if maybe you have great gender politics, or maybe you're great when it comes to misogyny, but you're homophobic, right? Yeah. That's not the kind of politics that we embrace, obviously, right? And we understand that like today, you want to be fully integrated, but there are ways in which we fall short.
Yeah.
We're still working it out.
Working it out. I really got that sense in the book. There was a way in which your faith perspective, particularly that willingness to view him through a lens of grace, like even like there is critique, but there's also grace, right? I saw that and I found that refreshing because it feels like we live in a time where there's not much grace. Like polarization in our world means that, we have to pick a side and we have to say who's our team and who's not our team. And part of what I found in reading your book was that it called me to get back in touch with my own values, right? The values of openness and forgiveness, and we can call things what it is, and we can be prophetic and like. I was really struck by that, right? Even the sense of hopefulness that I was getting out of the book. I was just really struck by that. So yeah, thank you
that is such an honor for me to hear and a joy because, I really do feel like So my first book is about sexual violence, right? My first book is about rape culture. And I remember I might have students that would say to me, Professor Jean-Charles, like, you're such a happy person, but you write about all these very depressing things like sexual violence. And I always would say, like, no, I feel like even when I'm writing about these things, there is hope and there's joy and there's grace, right? That kind of runs through it. And so to hear you say that about this book, which I feel is so different from the 2 academic books that I've written, really, really blesses my heart. So thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that came through.
Thank you. It's interesting because so even though I know this is a trade book, right? In a lot of ways, though, what you do, I think you do provide the sort of the theoretical philosophy, you provide the link between his vision, right, and letting us, like, you show there's a theology of his vision. There's he was strategic, but he was motivated by this deep vision. And what you do is you show the links between that and this very kind of I'm losing words today. I'm just but
okay,
in this very kind of strategic way, you kind of end up showing us, oh, here's the link between the work that he was doing, right? We can take this part of his speech, this part of this speech, and then if we take that and apply it to mass incarceration, if we apply it, right? And so I feel like there's a lot of really good, solid academic work that's here, right? It's not like you've just thrown that to the wind. There's really good, solid work and footnotes.
Indeed, footnotes. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think part of what I wanted to do was think about it as a framework, right? So like that was how I made sense of it. So let's look at the Trumpet of Conscience as a framework. And I say at the beginning, this is not a book about Martin Luther King, right? And it's funny because like I keep having to push back on people, like especially people when they invite me to like speak for Martin Luther King events. And I'm like, but my book is not actually about Martin Luther King, but it is about, but I think that that's what's important, right? Is like, maybe it's time for us as a people and as a generation and in the world to move beyond just memorializing him and instead think about what kind of frameworks is he offering us and how do so many of our contemporary movements offer, this was to your point earlier too, not just are in line of, but that offer a corrective, right, to the work that he was doing, to those frameworks. So yeah, I think you're right. You are absolutely right about that. And I couldn't in many ways I'm an academic writer. Like I can't take that away, strip myself of that.
Yeah. I really, for me, it was really helpful because on the one hand, as someone who has family members who are deeply connected to the civil rights movement, I am a great admirer of King. And on the other hand, there's part of me that resists and reacts against the way in which his legacy is often misinterpreted and misappropriated. And it's been misinterpreted for a very long time. And then over the past few years, we have really seen it being misappropriated by people on the far right, people using his image and big pieces, right, of his words, sound bites of his speeches, as actually weapons against movements, weapons against. I talked about the his son, right, online, and I remember once seeing someone trying to correct Bernice King and tell her she didn't know what her father would have thought about something, right? And so for me, I was so relieved in reading this book, the way in which it helped me to connect back to King in the complexity of it, right? And say, oh wait, no, they don't get to take him, right? Like they don't get to take his legacy. But yeah, it helped me to be like, yes, this is what we need to be celebrating. If there's anything we're going to celebrate, this is it. It's not letting them, letting folks do what they do to him. So I love that image of taking him out of the box, right? Especially out of the I have a dream box. It's not even the whole speech. It's like
it's like the last paragraph of the speech. I'm like, you all realize like there's so much more in this speech that you're not anyway. But no, I'll say this about that. So two things come to mind. Number one of the things that made me so angry was one time there was this, I think it was on Twitter, but there was I saw that someplace on social media, someone had said, oh, Martin Luther King, and it was some kind of right-wing person. Martin Luther King would never say Black Lives Matter because he believed in a colorblind world. And that just floored me, right? Because I was like, what are you talking about? Like, that's just not true. You're saying that Martin Luther King wouldn't just value Black life? And I think that's a really good example of the things that you're talking about that sometimes happen also on social media, with people trying to appropriate and misappropriate the message of King, right? And so again, my colleague Margaret Burnham, who I was in conversation with yesterday about the book, she gave a talk. You know, she marched on Washington. She knew King. She is a civil rights activist, and she gave a talk in 1992 in which she said, those of us who are part of this generation, we must not allow others to take it from us and to define it. We were there, we know what it is, and we must defend it, right? And so I'm so appreciative of the elders, right? Of the people of that generation who are still doing the work. I'm so appreciative of how, you know, after he died, right before he died, John Lewis had this beautiful letter that he had published in the New York Times and asked to only publish after he died, in which he speaks directly to the Black Lives Matter activists, and he speaks directly to the generation that is now protesting police brutality and the manifestations of white supremacy in this country. And he tells them that he's proud of them, and he tells them that they are doing exactly what the freedom fighters, Black freedom fighters in the 1960s, 50s, 60s were doing as well. So yeah.
Yeah. You point out how King both supported and critiqued young people, right? That a particularly young activists, that he thought they were a new breed of radicals, and that was making me think about what might he say about the folks today. And I think John Lewis's that final letter maybe points to what might have happened if he had. If he had lived and continued to be shaped through his relationships with young people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that. I'm trying to look through my.
It's also so sad, though. It also makes me so sad because, again, I think about the losses, that there is so much. I mean, I love that generation and the elders, and there's still so much trauma for them. And I think that there's so much to be learned from them. And I think what I love about, I keep bringing up Margaret, but people like Margaret is that they understand that they're also learning from these generations, right? So like I'm learning from my students, it's not just a one way. And even though there were some, I love some of those passages in the original Trumpet of Conscience, right, by King, where he talks about, youth and social action. Mm-hmm. And in some of those, we know that he and John Lewis, he and SNCC, he and the SC, like they butted heads sometimes, right? And so they were not always, again, he was not always on the right side of this, when it came to interacting with the youth and honoring them for their knowledge.
Yeah. At the same time, I think one of the things also noticing as I was reading your reflections, I was struck by how prescient his words often seemed, and really struggled with that as I was reading the sense in which. So he talked about the alienation, right, of people, and we're seeing the ways in folks feel alienated and the anger that arises from that. I was so surprised by how much his words at times seem to predict our current circumstances, almost like, kind of like reading Octavia Butler, right? You read Octavia Butler and you're like, wait, how did she know?
Where are you, Octavia?
Yeah. And so I wondered, was there anything that you read as you were kind of studying the Trumpet of Conscience, was there anything that really struck you in that way too, where you were like, wait, he's spot on for where we are today?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so much. How much time do you have? So first of all, the way that I start the book, right? I start the book with talking about this is a sick society, right? And that I'm like, I have my book everywhere, but I'm like, where is the original? Anyway, I don't see it, but that's okay. I'll do it from memory. So in the first chapter, in the introduction, which I called A Sick Society, and it was a quotation that he had where he says, this is a sick society. And so often he would use analogies about racism and disease, right? And unlike us, he didn't live through a pandemic. And unlike us, he didn't see how the pandemic magnified all of the already kind of racist ills and the ways inequality and injustice was just structured our society. And unlike us, he didn't live in this time where people would say, yes, now there are two pandemics, there's racial injustice and that. But it seemed like he kind of was in like had a foresight, right? I had some kind of foresight about that, and the way that he talked about all of those metaphors about sickness and racism and disease. Also the ways that he talks about militarism and the way that he talks about the police, right? And the way that he talks about, because when we understand how how policing works in this country, and when we understand the prison industrial complex in this country, we understand that we cannot detach that from militarism, right? And so the ways that he wrote about that, to me was just like, oh, this is exactly that. The ways that he writes about people's frustration. This is one that nobody ever wants to talk about. The comparison between material, like property, and people, right? And so he talks about, people are really critiquing the rioters for destroying property, but their lives are being destroyed. Their dignity is being destroyed. Their humanity is being destroyed. And are we really going to create an equivalence between property and people? I mean, that's right now, like that's, the past X number of years. So yeah, there's a lot in there. There's a lot in there.
Yeah, at times reading and noticing that, I kept asking myself, so there really is nothing new under the sun, right? Like, is it, he saw it because the situation hasn't changed much, right? And so then that brought me to this other point, which I think in your final chapter, skipping ahead to that a bit, as I wrestle sometimes with my own hopelessness, you pointed out that he was not always hopeful or optimistic. And I found that so helpful because in this time, I often feel like my hope wavers, my hope wavers quite a bit. There are times when I'm like, yes, we can do it. And there are other times when, I'm like, I don't know. This might be the end. I think America might be imploding. Do I need to leave? Right. There are times when I feel such some tremendous despair. And I like to look to the elders, right, to that generation to try to figure out how did they reignite hope when it seemed to be extinguished. And was there anything you learned from him about how he did that as you were writing this book?
So, I'll tell you, I learned, okay, so one of the places that I was really encouraged was when I read some of his prayers. I think those were really, and the humility with which he prayed, right? So he would say things like, God, like, this is not about me. Please, like, remove and minimize the man. But to be honest with you, the places where, for me, when I think about hope, it's actually the abolitionists, which gave me the most hope, right? It was the abolitionists again, the final chapter of the book is on prison abolition. And I go through some examples of women, of course, who are at the forefront of this movement, right? So Ruthie Gilmore, Mariam Kaba, and Angela Davis. And so Angela Davis has this beautiful quotation that I love from Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And she says, what has kept me going has been the development of new modes of community. And she's talking about how she's been able to be an activist for all these decades. So she says, what has kept me going has been the development of new modes of community. It is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism. And similarly, Mariam Kaba tells us hope is a discipline, right? And so those were kind of places that I felt like, oh yes, like those are anchors that I hold on to. And I'm always citing them to my students. The third one is also Bryan Stevenson, where he says, hopelessness is the enemy of justice, right? And so those three quotations for me are kind of like my sacred triumvirate, my sacred trinity of hope, because I think that number one, as Angela Davis tells us, that in order to keep your hope alive, so to speak, you have to surround yourself with other people who are also doing the work, who can lift you up when you're falling down, right? And this is what I was saying to the students at Agnes Scott today. Like, you don't know when you're going to be the one that has to step back or the one that has to step forward because someone else has to step back. But being in those communities of care, those circles of care, for me, often Black women, that are able to, when your hope is faltering, they're able to kind of like push you ahead or hold you up, right? Number two, hope is a discipline, Mariam Kaba, that hope takes work, and that you have to just keep at it, and that it's not easy, right? And that you keep kind of believing and you keep working. And then, of course, with Bryan Stevenson, that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. The thing is, like, hopeless, they want us to be hopeless, right? They want us to be hopeless, because once we're hopeless, we're like, all right, forget it. Like, voting rights, they're taking it away from us. Look, the filibuster, like, forget it. Let's stop our activism. After everything that Stacey Abrams and all those activists in Atlanta did, like, I mean, y'all are in Georgia, right? So it's like, so how pleased would they be that you all in Georgia would be like, okay, it's over. Forget all of our voting rights activism. They want, right? No, like, we keep on, and we keep on, not because we think that we will see it, but because we believe in something greater than ourselves, right? So like my ancestors, I'm Haitian, my ancestors, many of them who fought against the French in the Haitian Revolution, they never saw an independent and free Haiti, right? The same thing with, we know our ancestors, many of our ancestors here in the United States who fought, who led raids to free enslaved people. They never saw it. And similarly in the civil rights movement, right? So, and similarly, like I think about those of us who are right now fighting in the movement against gender-based violence, we might not in our lifetime see a world without sexual violence, but we believe that it is possible, and we keep fighting for it, not for ourselves, but for the generations that are coming after us, because they deserve it.
Yeah. You preached a word in that last chapter. You really did, because and that I think probably was the biggest surprise for me when you talked about abolition.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I've struggled with, right? It's something that I've struggled with, and I've wondered why I struggle with it, right? Mm-hmm. Around this notion of abolishing prisons. Mm-hmm. And the way you articulated the vision of that movement, mm-hmm. both brought me around to that, like, yes, now I get it, right? Like, and it was in the hope and the vision, right? This idea, and then to get back to King, this idea of dreaming the world, mm-hmm. right? Like, yeah. that what the abolitionists are asking us to do is to dream this world, yes. And then say, and now how do we strategize how to bring that world into existence, right? And so for me, that and pinning that together with hope, I mean, I closed the book, was like, we can do this, right?
Oh, that makes me so happy.
Yes, now we can do this, right? That it really is about maintaining that hopefulness, even maintaining that sense of history and recognizing like where we've come from, and yes, and keeping our eye on the prize, to use another cliche, right? But really to see the again, he seems so prescient, the moral arc of the universe. Because I wrestle. Sometimes I'm like, God, does it really? Is it really bending
Definitely.
towards justice? Because I'm not seeing
Right.
it.
Nope. I
But
know.
I
I
think when
understand.
you see folks like the abolitionists, the women especially, who are dedicated to this and who are saying, we believe this can happen, there is something infectious about that sort of hopefulness. I think because it's grounded in such recognition of despair and reality, right? But
Mm,
when people
yeah.
can be faced with that much despair and say, and we have hope, and we're
Hmm.
gonna cast this vision, like we're gonna say this is the vision we're working towards, and then we
Hmm.
want to um, strategize and organize and move our society to that point. Yeah, that was so beautiful. That was so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote that with a lot of love. I think it's also what has been really wonderful for me as a parent and as a mentor and as a professor is how useful that abolitionist framework is for organizing, right? So, I think about I think I probably wrote about in the book when I was at Boston College, and there were year after year, there would be very high profile racist hate crime, something that had happened. And the students would say, we're not happy. Like, we're protesting because the administration didn't respond the way we wanted to. And I'm like, well, how do you want them to respond? So, like, let's figure that out, right? And so, because you can always be like, y'all didn't do a good job, which is probably true of administrations everywhere, right? From like K through higher ed, as we know. But, I think to get the people who have been harmed to do that work of like, what would you have wanted? And understand and do that thinking to say, like, your voice matters and you have a vision. And why don't you tell us what are your ideas, and let's dream about it and let's imagine it and let's like try to figure that out. What is the vision? I think is really important. And I think it's what King was also doing, right? Like, as much as I deride people's obsession with I have a dream, that's what that's kind of what the idea is, right? Is that I have a vision. This is a vision. This is a dream. Nikki Giovanni, I talk about Nikki Giovanni in the books, right? Revolutionary dreams. And so the imagination is the space where our organizing must emerge from, because without our imaginations, we can't imagine. I mean, my ancestors had to imagine a world without slavery, when they had been under the yoke of this brutal French Empire for so many years. Like, you have to imagine it in order to execute the vision. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love the way that you call us to imagine, right? That, and I feel like that's really kind of where the book ends, right? It begins with thinking about the way in which King has been stuck in this moment,
Mm-hmm.
but in
Mm-hmm.
some ways brings us around to, but we actually have the power of that moment. We have the power of dreaming a new dream, a dream that
Yeah.
he didn't even imagine, right? Like we
Right.
can continue, we can expand the dream, right? We can expand the dream to include an
Yes.
end to sexual violence. We can expand the
Yes.
dream to include like the end of prisons, right? We
Transgender
can
people.
expand the dream.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. I love that, the way that it calls us into participating in this movement, which you are very clear. It did not start with him. Right.
Mhm.
At one point you say it started when the first Africans came here. That's when that movement started, right? The movement for Black Lives. It began at that point, but that we can continue in that regard. Oh, I
Mhm.
think we have questions popping up. I've kind of been looking at the questions to see.
So good.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah, so Dr. Régine Jackson says, you talk about King's very legitimate anger against racial
Mhm.
injustice in the book. Can you say more about King's anger? Oh, what a great question.
Yeah, I love King's anger because I think no one ever wants to talk about it, right? And I'm someone who also, again, as a person of faith and a follower of Jesus Christ, I often like loves to talk about Jesus's anger too, and how no one ever wants to talk about that. And I'm like, Jesus was very angry, and not just in that place where Jesus is like overturning the tables of the temple. Jesus is like, you, what is it? You like lost generation. Like, he was like
Yes,
shouting at people,
you brood of
right?
vipers. He was cursing people out all the time.
Right, exactly. So but yeah, I think that in some of these chapters, especially on when he's talking about nonviolence, and he's actually explaining how nonviolence has been trumpeted in many ways as the kind of best way to go, but he's acknowledging his understanding why some people wouldn't choose that, because legitimately these people have been so stripped of their dignity in a way that makes him angry, right? The anger, I think, also around the Vietnam War and his global understanding, like he has a global vision of injustice and inequities, and like his anger at the fact that in his name, which is so fascinating to me, because I'm like, on the one hand, you understand that like you're fighting because you understand that Black people in the United States are not seen as equal citizens, but at the other time, and at the same time, he's like so he's so not beholden to, but he's so kind of proud or holding on to this American identity and American citizenship. And so he's so angry that on the behalf of citizens like him, that this war is happening. I love those moments because, again, I think it's not the kind of gentle, nonviolent, colorblind, let's all hold hands king that everybody wants us to, many people would like us to focus on.
Yeah. Yeah, he was in touch with his anger and recognized and honored why other people were angry, right? And why they were angry to the point of violence, right? And he talked about that over and over again, especially as he talked about, what was labeled as riots, right? When he said, he talked about, the riot being the language of the unheard, right? He talked about that in the ways in which people might turn their violence inward because they were. So he understood that in a way that really does get underestimated and downplayed a lot.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are there other? Let me see if there are other questions. Are there other questions in the chat? I haven't seen other questions coming up because I know we're running out of time. So I wanted to make sure. So if you all have questions, those of you who are watching, this is a great time to put them there. I mean, I have lots of questions, but I want to make sure. I want to make sure that we can get to the questions that other people have. I knew there was another point I did not talk about, but let me see. Oh, okay. So I'll ask you this question. So you talked about there are a couple of times where you talk about kind of the ways in which we memorialize King, right? The days of service, right? You talk about the ones at your kids' own school that like, and what did that have to do?
Animal shelter. The animal shelter and the police packages. Yes, I was upset about that, but yeah.
Yes, the police. Yeah, and this is something I struggle with as a not just a parent, certainly as a parent when here in Georgia, because we had what was a little bit of snow the other day. So my kids' scout troop, they lost their day of service. It got canceled, but and part of me was like, and what were you supposed to do exactly? And what was it going to have to do with King's vision? What do you think about the way in which this idea of just service in any capacity has become seen as the substitute for, the activity to engage in on the King holiday?
I find it maddening. I think service is wonderful, and I think that we should be engaged in service at all, 365 days of the year, the other 364 days, not just on the King holiday. I think that it's white-centered. My partner has his own company, and his company is having a Martin Luther King Day of Service. And I was like, and so I was like, babe, did you not read my book? Like, I'm not going to say what this person, but so he actually hasn't participated, and he's one of the few Black people in the company. And it was at that point that I realized, I was like, oh, this is for white people. Like, like Black people, like, let's take a day off. Although if you work in higher ed, we all know that you're doing lots of service on Martin Luther King Day. You have to speak at the breakfast and all the things. but again, Margaret asked me this question when we had our conversation on Monday. And she said, her question was, what do you think would be a better way?
Yeah,
right.
That's what I was going to ask you next. Yeah.
And I was like, Margaret, I would actually love to see a service activity around mass incarceration. I would love to see a service activity that goes to people that are in prison, that's doing something like that. But it's always kind of the same. Again, the ones that really get me are like the animal shelter and stuff like that, which I can't figure that out. But there is a way that we could have a service activity around understanding the horror of war and militarism, right? I think that maybe what if you had a year-long project to partner with or give to the refugees in your community or support them, and on Martin Luther King Day do some activity, but let it be a year-long thing, right? So maybe the first thing would be like, let your service activity not just be on this day, but do it all year round. That's number one. Number two, kind of let's try to be more radical, right? Or less comfortable in what kinds of service that we're doing. Why don't we, think about the prisons? Why don't we think about the refugees? Why don't we think about really going into what does it mean to, thinking about militarism and materialism, right? And all these things. So that would be my second answer. And then my other thing is I'm like, Black people take a day off if you need to, right? Like that would serve us well.
Yeah. Let's see. What else? I'm trying to see.
It looks like you could. Oh, that's so funny. Someone's talking about a meme that they got. I did see a thing on Facebook not on Facebook, on Twitter that I love that said, as you post your Martin Luther King quotation today, may it inspire you to act according to that quote for the other 364 days of the year, right? Like,
yeah, that is so true. Yeah. We have another question in the chat, and then I think this will be our last question, and then we'll turn it back over to ER. But so somebody said, I loved how you were both talking about how nobody is perfect, and Régine always links activism with teaching and learning. Could you talk more about this?
Oh, talk about more linking activism, teaching, and learning?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just moved this year to a new institution. So I was at Boston College for 13 years. That's where I started my career. I became an assistant professor and went up through the ranks. And now I've moved and I'm a full professor and director of Africana Studies at Northeastern. And what's so great to me, what I enjoy the most about Northeastern is they have this vision of experiential learning. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the thing, what they espouse, right? So whatever you learn in the classroom, you have to kind of apply. And I was so impressed this past semester because it felt like the first time in my teaching career that I didn't need to tell students like, okay, we're reading these books and we're reading these articles, but they have to matter in the world too. All of my students in their presentations, for example, they would bring their activist selves to it. And they would tell us. So for example, I had students present on Edwidge Gentilcat's Breath, Eyes, Memory. And they talked about Boston's Haitian community. And then at the end, they had, all this information about if you're interested in volunteering in Boston's Haitian community, here are some organizations that you could get plugged into, right? So there's always this piece where they are looking to kind of plug it into something that is happening on campus, which I really, really enjoy. And I think, for me and for my teaching, the place where this has been the most relevant is probably the class that I taught on rape culture with a dear friend when I was at Boston College. And we had there was a requirement in our class, right, of a lab. And so we had our students working at these different organizations, anti-rape organizations, anti-violence organizations. So one of them was the Move to End Violence in Boston, right? So that's our Black Lives Matter in Boston, the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, and the Haitian Women's Center of Boston. And, we would tell our students, like, your job is to go there and do whatever they tell you to do. Like, your job is not to go in as a colonizer, and say, okay, here's how we're going to help you, but just whatever. And if what they want you to do is paint the walls, you're going to paint the walls. And part of it, what we're trying to teach them is what it takes to kind of be an organizer and how, and sometimes they would get frustrated. Like, we've emailed this ED about, our slideshow so many times and we haven't heard back from them. And we're like, yeah, you haven't heard back from them because this is not a high priority for them right now. They're like helping rape survivors that are in crisis. Like, you, college student that wants to know about your slide deck, is not a priority. And so also getting students to understand that there is a spirit of humility with which you must approach all organizing and activism, which we hope and pray will serve them well, in every kind of sphere of life. Wow. So I'm thinking about not just teaching, this is how you are an activist, or this is the organization you work with, but what is the kind of ethic, or what is the spirit with which you should approach this work? And I think literature, obviously I'm a literature scholar, I think literature is also very well positioned to teach us these kind of human values, right? What kind of ethic of generosity, of care, of compassion, of empathy that you can apply to the real world as you just live your life.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you for that question, because it reminded me that was another one of the gifts of this book, was the way you talk about teaching and the way in which you take this material and then you engage it with students in ways that it makes it come alive for them, and that hopefully engages them in activism, not just for the sake of the class, but for long term, right? That it hooks them in some kind of way in trying to build the type of world that we want to see.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. It is such an incredible book. I'm so grateful for the invitation to be part of this conversation and to have this opportunity to read this. I know ER is waiting to draw us to a close, so I'll invite him back in. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. This was a beautiful conversation, and I just really appreciate the invitation to remember the complexity of Dr. King and to really think about particularly his socialist speeches and some of the work he did towards the end of his life that folks just really want to sweep under the rug a lot of the time. And so and the anti-war work that he did, because we need it right now more than ever, I think. And so this is a wonderful invitation. So thank you both so much for being here. I want to encourage folks who are watching at home, you can buy Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience Today via this teal button in the bottom center of your screen. You can buy Dr. Walker-Barnes' books out of the links in the chat right here. So I Bring the Voices of My People and Too Heavy a Yoke. Those are both right there. If you click, you can also see Dr. Jean-Charles' first book through that teal link as well. So thank you so much to Agnes Scott College, and especially to the Gay Johnson McDougall Center. Thank you to Dr. Jackson for making this possible. Thank you, Dr. Walker-Barnes, for hopping in here and being with us tonight, and for your grace as always in coming together and helping make things possible. I really appreciate it. So I hope that you both stay safe and well in our ongoing wild times in this country and beyond, and that eventually, Dr. Jean-Charles, we'll get to have you here on campus, because we would love to get to host a more intimate in-person event for you at some point.
I would love that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Dr. Chanequa. Thank you so much. And yeah, be safe, everyone. Be well.
Yes. Take care. Have a great night.